Welcome to 2312, the making of modern Europe, or its official name, Western Civilization 2. So I want to begin the semester by looking at a video from 2018 and to make the argument that in fact what it does is offer us a history lesson as to what is at the heart of European history and what will be the main themes of European history that we will tackle over the course of the semester. So this is a video from Beyonce and Jay-Z called H. And when it first came out, it caused quite a stir because it was filmed in the Louvre Museum at the heart of Paris. And this is so unusual as to warrant particular scrutiny. So I want to think first as to why they film in the Louvre Museum. So in many ways, the Louvre Museum, it may hold the center, the heart of what we consider to be the history of so-called Western civilization and its emergence. Now, the Louvre is first and foremost a historic monument. It was first built as a fortress in the 12th and 13th century, and it was turned into a residence for French kings after the 1789 French Revolution, or rather it was no longer a residence, and then from the mid-1500s, it was a royal residence for kings. But the 1789 French Revolution meant that this ended the era of kings and established a republic, a democracy, and brought about the foundational text of Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which declared freedom of right, but also enshrined property as a right. And we'll see how that tension, in fact, is at the heart of what emerges to be modern Europe. And we date modern Europe, its emergence, to 1789. And this is subsequently that it became later a museum. Now today, the Louvre is the world's largest museum with an art collection that ranges from antiquity to the present day, 38,000 objects over just under 80,000 square feet. And many of these objects, in fact, are today the subject of controversies because they're the result of colonial conquest and appropriation, and the countries from which they were plundered are asking for their repatriation, whether it be in the Middle East or on the African continent or the Asian continent. But in 2018, the Louvre was the world's most visited museum with 10.5 million visitors. This means that the choice to film in the Louvre is more than a question of making a cool looking video. And that is because the Louvre is said to be the temple of Western civilization. And I'd like to put Western civilization in quotation mark because civilization is not and has never been a neutral word. It's a politically charged word that marks some as humans and others as not quite human or not fully human. Now, the original definition of civilization means that it refers to a people, culture, and world that has reached a high degree of cultural, political, and economic development. Now, notice in the definition that it will imply a comparison and a contrast to those that now have achieved the same high level of development. Now, what that means is that the term civilization has been, over time, been used to refer to those who are its opposite, that is uncivilized. And civilization is often opposed to people who are believed to be barbarians, savages, primitives. And this is translated into a series of hierarchical oppositions where one is positive and the other negative. Civilization versus primitive, West versus East, North versus South. So what it is it's a problematic term that centers one type of people as superior to another. And if we know that Western civilization is a term that over time has been used to describe a Western European framework, we see how it centers Europe as that which is superior, above everyone and everything else. Now, what is important to think about is that the history of modern Europe is, in fact, as the history of Western civilization, is the history of empire and colonialism. That is the conquest of non-European territories and the subjugation and forcible and violent rule over non-Europeans. And the building of European empires involved, as Alexander Weheliye argued, techniques of domination, dispossession, expropriation, exploitation, and violence. So if we take that into account, what we learn is that what the art in the Louvre and the Louvre itself allow us to forget because of its glory and prestige is precisely the very history that allowed it to exist. That is, that the glory, prestige, and cultural achievements of modern Europe were built on that history of conquest, domination, dispossession, expropriation, exploitation, and violence. The delight and pleasure of museums erase the horrors and violence of slavery and colonialism. That is why I want us to think of Beyonce's video as both a history lesson and a political text that very clearly tells us about the ways in which colonialism, slavery, capitalism, gender, and culture have been at the heart of the making of the myth of Western civilization, and how the video itself is an argument challenging this inherited past that still shapes our present. Now, the video indeed does begin by reminding us that the Louvre is the temple of Western civilization, that we are to understand is home to the canon of this civilization, the sanctioned and universally accepted body of works that is supposed to represent it. And here what we have are panning shots of the corridors that tell us about how we are to admire these objects, that tell us about the glory of Western civilization. And here, the first panning shot that leads us to Beyonce and Jay-Z. So that canon itself was made through slavery and colonialism, and that is what the video subverts and seeks to undo. First of all, because a museum is a highly regulated institutional space. So first and foremost, by occupying and inhabiting that space, Beyonce and Jay-Z are, in the words of Christina Sharp, disrupting the traditional hierarchical organization of the museums, which doesn't usually welcome the kinds of people that are not considered to be at the heart of Western civilization. So how do they do that? Well, we see them posing in front of the Louvre's most iconic objects, posing in front of the Venus de Milo in ancient Greece, that is considered to be one of the great legacies of ancient Greece. But the video does more than show Black individuals and Black bodies in a space where they're usually not allowed or even considered to belong. Its work is much more political and much more complicated. In fact, it is a direct challenge to the history of Western civilization, which is defined by Weheliye as the barring of non-white subjects from the category of the human. So next, I'm going to show you a range of strategies that the video deploys to tell us this. First of all, what does it mean to have Black people entering this space? First of all, we see living and moving bodies that relegate art born out of colonialism to the background. And that is actually the most obvious point made in many of the articles that came out after the video, especially with this recurring scene of Beyonce and dancers in front of some of the Louvre's most iconic painting. And in fact, that is the effect repeated throughout the video, repeatedly, as we see then Beyonce dancing in front of the Sphinx of Tanis, the Venus de Milo, in this particular moment. Now, what the video also does is it reveals the ways in which Blackness is in fact central to the history and the artistic production of Western civilization. And it is precisely the centrality of Blackness that has been erased. Now, it's not an accident that we begin with an image of the Sphinx of Tanis, brought back from Egypt. Now, it's believed to date back to the Old Kingdom of Egypt. And in fact, ancient Egypt and its history have an African history that is often not taught and has been historically erased. So that ancient Egypt is usually not associated to African history, but as the predecessor to ancient Greece and Rome, as the birthplace of civilization and democracy. Now, the argument that Blackness is central recurs and repeats in different ways. First of all, we see paintings of those who were slaves or enslaved and who have been represented in paintings, as in this very painting that I'll return to later. So we see this in very particular moments. So the portraits of enslaved individuals, but we also see it in other particular ways in which those images are chosen to be seen. Now here, what we see is, in fact, to the left of your image, you will see what is shown in the video, and to the right, the original painting. And notice two aspects. First of all, that the painting has been cropped. In the original painting, what you have is, in fact, a painting that encourages the voyeurism and the fetishistic gaze of a white colonial gaze. And the cropped painting in the video, in fact, restores the dignity to the woman who was painted, and, in fact, who remained unnamed and was only referred to as Portrait of a Black Woman until 2018. And when a historian did research and find out who she was in this way. Now, again, as I was telling you, this argument that Blackness is central recurs in different ways. We see it especially when the image cuts to minor and fleeting moments and details that can go unnoticed in otherwise predominantly white European art, as in this focus, zeroing on the detail of the raft of the Medusa, or this particular one from the Renaissance, or this again in this, but also in images that will be particularly evocative in the political argument that this video makes. Now, the video, in fact, reminds us, shows us, teaches us how slavery is at the heart of the capitalist revolution that allowed Europe to emerge as a modern world power in the 18th century. And I'd like first to make the point that slavery was a European affair before it was an American one. And in fact, slavery and colonialism are the silent and invisible ways in which modern Europe has built itself. Now, what we have here, for instance, is echoes. So on the left, you have the image of the dancers on the steps that recurs through the video that directly echo the image of a slave ship, one of its most famous images that was designed to show how those who had been enslaved were nothing more than commodities or objects to be sold in the Caribbean for the practice of slavery. Now, we see, and it is not a surprise, that the video showcases many 19th century neoclassical paintings because these were produced at the moment when Europe colonized over 90% of the world's landmass. Now here we have probably my most favorite image, because what we have on the wall is a very famous portrait of an elite French woman, Madame Récamier, painted by David, who was known to make large-scale paintings. And what we have in front as the reminder of that which has been erased is, in fact, two of the dancers that dance with Beyonce, sitting here with a piece of white cotton that ties them together, but also suggests that they are the ones. It is through the labor and the bodies of Black women that this glory, this prestige, and this prosperity is built on, and that we too often would rather forget. So what this painting does is it constantly reminds us, this and others, of the complex ways in which this particular history is still connected to the present. Just as in this moment, we see Jay-Z turning to another very famous painting, an early 19th century painting by Théodore Géricault, a French painter, called The Raft of the Medusa. The Raft of the Medusa, it represents, is the painting of a shipwreck filled with soldiers and administrators who are on their ways to Senegal in Africa, that is to become a French colony. Now here, what we have is indeed the evocation of the violence and death that attends to colonialism, but it is also a reminder of the current tragedy that haunts Europe. That is how there are every day since the early 2000s, thousands or hundreds of refugees who are coming from the African continent, from the Middle East, crossing the Mediterranean, and more often than not, dying at sea because Europe won't allow them in. So much so that the Mediterranean is considered to be a living cemetery for all of these refugees. So what we have is this reminder that situates us in relationship to this history, but we also see a repetition and a resignification of the Western canon. First, to subvert and undo established authority. Now here, if I return to the image that echoed the slave ship, to me it's important that these dancers are not inert, they're not there like unmoving dead bodies. In fact, they're reaching and they are moving, literally rewriting history. And here a note that this is also an argument about the ways in which art intersects with consumerism and fashion, because the dancers' very clothing is borrowed from artist Vanessa Beecroft's collaboration with Kanye West over his fashion collection. So here, what we have is how to undo slavery. Now, these bodies are no longer objects, in fact, they are moving, they are living, and they are breathing, undoing that legacy. Now, I would like to point again to this other recurring image, and to argue that it is not a coincidence. This is the one that recurs more often. This is an image taken from the video where Beyonce is dancing in front of David's painting of Emperor Napoleon's coronation as emperor. Now, why is this significant? Because Napoleon dreamt of an empire in Europe itself, as well as elsewhere. He colonized Egypt. And in this particular painting, he is shown crowning his wife, Josephine, empress. And this is how prestige and power are anchored by colonialism, because Josephine, his wife, was born in Martinique, the French slave colony. And there she had come from a wealthy Creole family that owned sugarcane plantations. And Napoleon is also the one who reestablished slavery in Martinique and Guadeloupe in 1804, after the French Revolution had abolished it in 1794. Now, here is this relegation to the background of slavery and colonialism, and in the significance that it is Black women's performance and embodiments that makes an intervention into Western art. Now, I'd like to show next how throughout the video we see this rewriting of history through the evocation and resignification of iconic images that are brought into the present and made political. And these moments punctuate the video with insistence. If we look at the video, if we look at this couple that directly echoes the painting to the left, or the Greek statue kneeling, while we see these young Black men kneeling in a reminder of the protest that took place a few years ago. But also this evocation of hands tied by the ropes of slavery, or the spears as a sign of resistance and revolution. So what we have is a systematic contrast between the past and its inert art and contemporary living and moving people that reinvent it and make it their own. And just as we see Beyonce echoing, but also reinventing the Venus de Milo in this particular clip, or in front in another very striking images in front of so another iconic statue of the Greek era. Now, this argument and this rewriting of the canon is epitomized in the very ending of the video, where in fact what we will see is a return to Jay-Z and Beyonce. But first, this is done through a homage to a tradition of Black artists that the video gestures to and in fact borrows to signify how there is also a presence of Black artists reinventing and contributing to the canon, and who may even now be the canon, like this particular quilt on the left, which is literally about dancing at the Louvre, that presumably inspired what takes place in the video, or this particular image in front of the Mona Lisa, which is itself a reference to the work of two prominent artists. On the left, Carrie Mae Weems, and on the right, a reinvention in 2018. And last, I want to point you to the work of Kehinde Wiley, who is famous for having done a portrait of President Obama. And look to the left, where you will see a reinvention of the portrait of Madame Récamier that you saw earlier. Now, another homage that is muted and never acknowledged as such is, in fact, that the very idea of this video, which was filmed by Ricky Sayes, was first takes its inspiration from Isaac Julian, a Black British filmmaker who filmed in 1993 in the Wilberforce Museum, a museum dedicated to the memory of slave abolition, which in fact subverts Western civilization through the work of undoing its very codes and regulations, through the portrayal of S&M gay sex, the reversal of racial hierarchies, as you can see on the left, and on the right, again, the prominent Black British intellectual Stuart Hall in front of a famous painting from the early 19th century. And all this leads us to the end of the video. Back to the long panning shot with Beyonce and Jay-Z in front of the Mona Lisa, probably the most famous painting housed in the Louvre, which began the video. And here what we see is, in fact, how at the end they turn their backs on us, the viewers, to look at the Mona Lisa. Now, some have argued that this is an argument about how they are consumers and creators of art. But I would argue it does more than say something about capitalism or consumerism. It is about the making of Black subjectivity. It is about fashion and art and its porous boundaries. It is about the genealogy of Black art and Black artists. And it is an argument about that very brutal legacy that needs to be undone. That contemporary objects can tell us about the past, its relation to the present, and how history is both made and unmade. I hope you've enjoyed the video and this interpretation, and I look forward to discussing these themes with you throughout the course of the semester. Thank you.